I had a patient, I would say 3 or 4 months ago, whose wife, sadly, was having necrotizing fasciitis of the leg and had to have an urgent amputation, right? Otherwise, she would not live. And her spouse, the first thing he said to me was, wait, am I going to have to sell my house so she can get surgery? And I said, how have we come to a point where he's not even worrying about whether she's going to survive through this?
Welcome to Critical Care Time, the podcast for everyone who cares for the critically ill. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Cyrus Askin, here with the other host, the lovely and wonderful and handsome Nick Mark.
Well, thanks for that introduction, buddy. You motivate me to be better, just like this morning when I was out on my run and you texted me or like, we're recording in 25 minutes. Gentle reminder. And I look at my watch and I'm like, I'm 30 minutes from home. I better run faster. So anyway, you motivated me. I appreciate that.
Happy to help whenever I can. I mean, we've been in the throes of moving and our life has just kind of been, I guess like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, flip turned upside down, as it were.
Did you move via taxi?
Oh my gosh, yeah, we might as well have. No, I also made the very ill-advised decision of buying a vehicle prior to moving, and of course I got suckered into buying another electric vehicle, which of course meant I needed to charge like 15 times on the way. But that stretch between El Paso and San Antonio is really brutal. There's not much to do, not much to see, and the charging stations are few and far between. So, yeah.
My experiences driving in Texas have always been like, merge onto highway whatever, drive 200 miles, then bear right. It's like,
yeah,
lots of straight.
That's about right. That's about right. So, today we're going to talk about something that we've touched on a little bit here and there, but it's a topic that I think is really important to anyone who works with the critically ill. And, as our podcast would suggest, that's kind of an aim of ours. So really, today we've got a fantastic guest who's going to talk to us about burnout and moral injury in the ICU. We're going to introduce him in just a second, but yeah, Nick, definitely a topic that I think we're both passionate about and excited to talk about. I'm just curious, Nick, what your thoughts might be on burnout and moral injury.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important topic that comes up a lot. I think sometimes people tend to minimize it because it gets sort of put into that bucket of like, oh, this is just some training module I have to click through, instead of like an incredibly impactful topic that affects all of us, particularly people who work in a stressful, high stakes job as we do, where we often deal with, not just stress, but also loss. So I think really important topic. I'm glad we're talking about it today. And I'm really excited that we have a guest to sort of guide us through this discussion.
So, as we've been kind of alluding to here in the last minute or so, we've got a phenomenal guest who's going to be with us. We have the pleasure today of hosting Dr. Venktesh Ramnath. Dr. Ramnath earned his BA in biochemical sciences from Harvard and his MD from Mayo Clinic. He trained in internal medicine at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell, served as chief resident at New York Downtown Hospital, and completed pulmonary and critical care fellowship through the Harvard program at Mass General, Brigham and Women's, and Beth Israel Deaconess. So all these like correspondence universities.
Yeah, it's like
no one's ever heard
of. Very shameful pedigree there.
I can't imagine you hang any of those on the wall. Since then, he's led ICUs across diverse settings nationwide and abroad, including rural, community, and academic hospitals. Since 2017, he's been at UC San Diego, where he's a professor of medicine, medical director for critical care and telemedicine outreach, and ICU medical director at the VA San Diego. My goodness. Welcome, Venktesh.
Thanks a lot for having me, guys. I'm a real fan of your show, and so I'm excited to talk about this topic.
All right. Well, I always like to ask people, kind of like, what got you into this? What's your superhero origin story? Why is this the topic that has motivated you so much?
Well, that's a great question, because it didn't start out by me thinking about what happens in burnout, but and I definitely would not qualify myself as a superhero. I'm one of the masses of folks trying to just make a difference in the world. But my entry into pulmonary critical care,
looking like a superhero,
by the way. Right. I don't even know how to respond to that. I will say that my path to pulmonary critical care is a little bit circuitous, maybe like some of your audience and maybe you guys too. I wanted to be an ENT surgeon, actually, all through medical school. And When I got at the end, I said, I actually like internal medicine just way too much. And so my path veered quite strongly in a different direction. But as I made my way through the different specialties, in internal medicine, between GI, I kind of flirted with that first, and then nephrology. It was just critical care that brought it all together because I could do all the different stuff that I loved about internal medicine, but with a surgeon sort of sensibility, right? Trying to make a difference in the moment. And so that kind of took me to critical care. And then pulmonary was just sort of icing on the cake. I could think about ventilators and lungs, and I've asthma. So heck, I mean, it just had a personal connection too. So I did my training. And when I finished, I said, there's so much that I've learned in these pretty esteemed institutions, but I want to take it to the community. I want to take it to outside the ivory towers. And so that's where I joined an academic practice that served several communities, some of which were really diverse communities ethnically and even financially in the greater Boston area. And it's really then that I started becoming aware for the first time that there were other pressures that were outside of just knowing the latest and greatest scientific knowledge and intervention, all those tools that we used at Mass General and Brigham and all those places. I was totally unprepared. There were things like workplace politics, just how to navigate those relationships. There was the financial pressures of medicine. There were the operational things like how to get patients through the ED to the ICU, to the OR, to the wherever. And I will say I was completely just overwhelmed. I didn't know how to navigate it. I got myself into hot water. We had a Medicare audit that didn't really go that great. Fractured relationships that I was still trying to build. And at that point, I tried what I could, but I said, maybe I should look for a different position. Maybe there's a better fit out there. So I moved from position to position and ended up actually in Texas. And along the way, I got really interested in telemedicine. I was in the Bay Area for a while. So the digital health and all those innovative technologies kind of took me to an interesting direction. And so when I went to Texas, I tried to do both. I tried to sort of, cultivate and nourish that innovative side of me, but I also tried to feed or scratch that clinical itch, being the ICU physician that I'd always wanted to be. But I ended up just getting deeper into issues until I hit a wall. And I faced this existential crisis where I'm like, is this what it is to be a physician? I don't know if I can do this. And I thought maybe I need to leave medicine. And so as I was trying to sort of find my footing, I ended up just joining a per diem practice a couple miles up the road at a different hospital. And really by kind of trial and error, I just started doing things differently. I started communicating in a different way. I mean, it was just sort of almost like a protective, just sort of defensive way of just trying to get through the day. And to my incredible surprise, things started working and opening up in ways that I just did not anticipate at all. And as I kind of made my way back brick by brick, I ended up really finding a way of practice in medicine that has been incredibly fulfilling. And that ended up leading me to UC San Diego, where I broadened it and cultivated it more. And honestly, looking back, I was definitely in the throes of full-fledged burnout. But I can say today that, some of the things that I had to learn really in a tough way have gotten me to a place now where I can actually move through it. And I feel more fulfilled than I think I ever have been in my career. So that's a long way of saying that it's been a long journey. And recently, I've really just gotten more and more interested in learning about burnout. Where did it come from? How did it evolve? How does it affect us? And not just intensivists, which obviously I am, but all of us as physicians, as healthcare professionals, and those adjacent to physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, all the people we work with to make sure that the healthcare delivery is as good as it can be. So sorry for that short answer.
No, that's a great answer. I want to double click on a couple of things you said. I just want to comment on something first, though, which is that it really does seem to me that a lot of the burnout that I see around me doesn't stem from the clinical work. It stems from the inbox full of administrative tasks and other things. It's kind of interesting, like what you said, that like our training prepares us to take care of sick people, but it doesn't necessarily prepare us for the everything else that goes into our job, all of those like logistical, operational, administrative tasks.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely 100%. And I will say that as I've made my way through my career, I've realized that there are four different pressures that I think are part of what it means to be a modern physician. And that includes intensivists, of course. And let me just talk about them briefly. So one of them is there's just too much information out there, right? It's just an information overload, time in history, and misinformation is at the forefront there too. And like, how do you navigate that? How do you keep up with what's current, but also differentiate fact from fiction? I mean, that is not an easy task, right? The second thing is there's all kinds of technology out there, from genomic therapies to telemedicine to wearable sensors to now AI, which is the rage, and who the heck knows where that's going, right? The third thing is I feel that we have a healthcare delivery system that is so incredibly complex and fragmented, and physicians are just not prepared or trained or educated around what that even looks like. So they come in two forms. One is what I call the vertical network of healthcare, which is all these different places where patients can get care. So it's the hospitals. It's not just hospitals in general. It's primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary hospitals, right? And each place has its own special flavor of what they offer and how they offer it. And then there are long-term acute care facilities. There are skilled nursing facilities. There are urgent cares. There's freestanding ERs. I mean, there's so many places where patients can get care. And intensivists are kind of caught out, right? Because we see people in a very narrow part of their care journey, and we're being asked more and more to explain and interpret where the heck they're going. I had a patient recently who had a stroke, occipital stroke, and I'm trying to explain to them what the stroke is. And the family stopped me short and said, no, we all know about that. I mean, we've read about that online. But where is my mom going from here? Like, we live in Chicago and I'm in San Diego. And, how are you communicating with the physicians there? Does she need rehab? Like, who are the other people? My God. And if I had not been sort of educated and had that gap filled from my knowledge base in advance, I would have been looking pretty dumb, So there's that part. And then there's what I call the horizontal network of healthcare, which is all the people who are touching some part of the patient's care. So it could be the nurse practitioner, or it could be a physician assistant, or it could be the dietitian, or the pharmacist, or the social worker, or the case manager, or a slew of other people, right? And then there's the physicians who are either generalists, specialists, subspecialists, now even sub-subspecialists. So of course, how do you coordinate all that? How do physicians and intensivists pull all that together? Okay, that's a long way of saying point number 3. And then the fourth issue, that pressure, is the financial one. I think the physicians, like you said, Nick, we're just not trained or even told that it's important to know how financial viability is crucial to any clinical program. If you can't keep the lights on, you have no patients to see. And so I've had to really educate myself and at least have a workable understanding and be versed in things like coding and billing practices and the differences between a 99233 and a 992232, for example, or what advanced care planning codes are, or what a case mix index is, or what payer mixes affect the populations that I serve. Why? Because it is part of my job. And patients are even asking me about that kind of thing. So there's a long way of saying that the pressures on the modern physician, and then the intensivist is included in that, are just different. And so I would say that, today, to survive, and not just survive, but to thrive and to work through this burnout that affects almost half of our physician workforce, I think we have to radically accept that this is a new era in being a physician. And it introduces this idea that I sort of conceptualized, and actually have written a book on this now, which hopefully will be published soon, about being a health architect, about how a physician needs to pull in all these different things that aren't part of the traditional teaching and training of being a physician, but are really just crucial to the enterprise, crucial to the mission of being, whether you're a generalist or an intensivist. You really have to pull all that together. And when you can, there is a path forward, and it's not just professional, it can be personal.
Wow. There's so much to unpack there. And I think that was an incredible overview of some of what we're going to touch on today. Um, yeah, I just have so much running through my head from like why you got into medicine in the first place or why you got into pulmonary critical care, which resonates with me very much, all the way through the trials and tribulations that you've endured in an already, robust and illustrious career. So I mean, that's just incredible. And I'd love to spend hours just like picking your brain on all that. But instead of spending the rest of the day doing so, I think maybe we could touch on the different areas that you've mentioned. And it kind of dovetails nicely with a question I had. So I know that you've published in a number of places, the LA Times being one, and sort of in conjunction with this idea of information overload and misinformation, I think in your LA Times piece, you talked about this idea of misinformation, kind of the anti-vaccine diatribe, verbal abuse that then sort of came with that. The staff are poisoning patients or punishing people. And obviously I can imagine that takes I don't have to imagine, I lived it too. It does take a really profound psychological toll on you as a person who's trying to be a caregiver. And so maybe from that information standpoint, I'm curious as to how that kind of that huge amount of information and the huge amount of misinformation has sort of fostered this culture almost of mistrust in healthcare providers. And then how that culture of mistrust could be a key contributor to the burnout that we're discussing today.
Yeah, that's a great question. And trust is a theme that I think is just going to get stronger with time, that we just have to regain uh, purchase on, right? So it's no surprise to anybody listening to this podcast or works in critical care or medicine in general, but certainly the ICU. It's emotionally taxing, right? We're dealing with organ failures, life and death, decision making, end of life, family dynamics, you name it. It's an overwhelming experience, not just for patients and families, but for us as providers, right? And now we have an added layer of mistrust from sort of left field, right? We just weren't prepared for that. And I would say that it comes from several places, and we probably need a whole other podcast to unpack all that, right? But I'll say that there are three areas that I think are particularly salient when it comes to mistrust. At least let's talk about what's not specific to physicians and what they can do. We'll get to that in a second. But the access to information is just unprecedented, right? We can get information anywhere from our cell phones to online to wherever, the media. And that goes for misinformation too. And we just haven't figured out how to sort it out, how to sort out what the fakes and the deep fakes are and the real stuff. And compounding that issue is the sort of conflicting messaging that's coming out of some of the places that we looked for guidance, whether it's the CDC or the HHS, the Center for Disease Control, or the Health and Human Services, or any public health institutions. I mean, the messaging is kind of chaotic, right? And so we don't have a bedrock of certainty to sort of lean on. That goes for patients, but also goes for us as providers. And then social media, as you know, just takes things viral in seconds. And we're always playing catch up, right? I remember this being during COVID, where all of a sudden intubating patients became sort of anathema or like some kind of dangerous thing. Where, I mean, it's funny. I was talking to researchers up in University of Washington about their response in the Blue Journal, the American Journal of Critical Care Medicine, Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine, and they were just saying, like, once you get a bad idea out there, it's so hard to reset the balance. So yes, there is definitely this whole information misinformation divide that is hurting us and substantiating mistrust. The other is, I already alluded to, is this maze of care networks and care providers. I mean, there's just too many people in too many different places, and it just, there are too many cracks for things to fall into. And patients start saying, what the heck is going on? And why don't people know what's going on? There must be something else happening, right?
Right.
And so with that uncertainty comes mistrust. And then the
Yeah.
third thing is financial stress. I mean, I have never thought in my career that I would have patients literally asking me what it's going to cost for someone to go to surgery or be in the ICU. I had a patient, I would say 3 or 4 months ago, whose wife, sadly, was having necrotizing fasciitis of the leg and had to have an urgent amputation, right? Otherwise, she would not live. And her spouse, the first thing he said to me was, "Wait, am I going to have to sell my house to so she can get surgery?" And I said, how have we come to a point where he's not even worrying about whether she's going to survive through this? He's worrying about, can he go home and have something to eat or have a place to live? And another example, like I had,
What a choice that is, by the way,
well, I
right?
know it's just a
That
horribly tragic, and to be
healthcare, the
part of that,
leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States, right? And people
yes,
are forced to make this choice every day. It's horrible.
right, right. And we as intensivists are having to help patients understand that and navigate it, right? Another example, just to briefly, is a 94-year-old lady was having an end of life terminal situation, and I talked about comfort care and hospice, and they all agreed, the family all agreed, but they said, you know what? Wait, is her Medicare going to cover this? And I said, well, yeah, I think so. And they said, no, 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 you really don't know. You really don't know. And I have to say that he made me reflect. This is her son, because we've been basically told for years and years during training not to care about it, not to even consider it, because it is, there is some truth to this. There is some perception of a conflict of interest, right? When some of those other external factors come into play. But we live in a time when you cannot look away from that. You can't not, and that is where, circling back to mistrust, when you can't answer and you can't be with them on the same page, that fosters mistrust. And so that layer is just something that we have to take seriously. Now, it can show up, this mistrust, and these difficult situations can appear in different ways, right? We can have patients basically not take our recommendations. They can express doubt. It could be more aggressive. It could be, hey, I want a second opinion, right? I mean, who hasn't gotten that? But then also it could be even more aggressive, and unfortunately, this is more towards nurses where they're 24/7 at the bedside. But
Right.
workplace violence is a real thing. It could be verbal, but it could also be physical. And so
Mhm.
this is a problem. Now, what can physicians do? What can intensivists do? Well, I think there are a couple of things we can do. One is we can lean into what Lee McIntyre in his book called the scientific attitude. And what does that mean? Well, we have this foundation of evidence, empirical evidence that gets us to solve problems and fix disease in different ways. And yet we have sort of, at least I've noticed this, we've kind of moved away from it as a physician community in the sense of, sure, we still use evidence in certain ways, but what I'm hearing more and more at the bedside is, well, this is my experience. This is what we're doing. Or, hey, this is my style of practice. We're not citing evidence to our peers anymore and saying, hey, look, let's talk about this and really just analyze it and see what fits here. This is not to say that scientific evidence should just trump everything at the bedside. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I feel like it's sort of left out of the equation in ways that I think foster this uncertainty gap that may lead to consideration of misinformation sources, but also the mistrust. So I think that that's one aspect that we could do, is to just have more reliability and consistency around. Hey, look, let's talk about the evidence as a point of solidarity, as a unified front to patients. The second thing is we don't really talk about prognosis. And Nicholas Christakis, who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania, has written a whole book on this, about how doctors avoid prognostication. And he cites various reasons. They're very understandable reasons, but everything from perceptions of liability to just being unprepared for difficult conversations to even what he has studied as a self-fulfilling prophecy. He's actually seen that physicians feel that if they say something bad's going to happen, it's actually going to happen. So it's kind of this magical thinking that's part of our thing. I mean, we're human beings, so there's no judgment there, but that's part of the issue. And I would say that when I have talked about prognosis, and we can dig into what I mean by that, it's not just putting up a risk score and saying, X, Y, and Z is going to happen. That's not exactly what I mean by that. But when you have an honest conversation about what's happening and why, patients appreciate the honesty. I've yet to hear a patient say to me, "You've been too honest, you've been too blunt, you've been too direct." They don't say they actually say the opposite. They say, "Thank you for being so honest with me." And people want to be treated like adults. They don't want to be talked to as if they don't understand or that they're children or that we need to sugarcoat it for them. In fact, Sunita Puri wrote a New York Times essay. She's a palliative care physician about how this is a couple of years ago, how she, as a palliative care physician, had some hesitation about talking about death, where her patient actually taught her, "Hey, look, actually, doctor, I am okay with talking about death. Let's talk about it." And I think as intensivists, because we're faced with that every day, I don't shy away from it. And it helps me build some of that trust back because we're talking as equals. The third thing, which just sort of alludes to this, is the communication. I think in intensive care, we think that communication is a soft skill. And I'll say physicians in general. I'm not going to throw all intensivists under the bus, but we don't see communication in the same way that we see putting in a central line or intubating, or we have a checklist. We go through you choose your algorithm, your lemon criteria for intubating, or your checklist for putting in a central line, whatever. We don't do that when we communicate. I have learned that I need to do that, and over time, I actually have developed a 5-step method myself that's evidence-based for my family meetings. And it doesn't mean you spend 2 hours in a family meeting. It's actually gotten to a point where I can do this, and I've practiced it enough where I can be extremely effective in 15, 20 minutes, and sometimes even shorter. The expectation of those communication approaches, though, is to build the trust. That is the single objective that is the most important. It's not about getting to DNR. It's not getting to comfort care or the trach or whatever it is. It's about building the trust, because if you don't have the trust, you don't have anything. And I've just learned that over and over in intensive care, right? We're dealing with lab tests and interventions and procedures and God knows what, right? But if you don't have the trust of the people who are receiving the care, you are already setting yourself up for problems. But the flip side is, if you can do that, if you can lean into that, then I think the doors open and you may be pleasantly surprised with what you realize and also what can come next.
Great. I feel like we have a lot of we've like sort of like this is like an advent calendar of different topics, and there's like lots of little doors we can open and go into, and I want to go into like several at once. I mean, I guess, talking about communication and end of life is probably a good place to talk for a few minutes. I mean, I think one interesting thing I've observed is that sometimes the staff feels very strongly that about what somebody's code status should be, and then maybe the family feels differently. And I think that that's a big source of moral injury and burnout in the ICU. I wonder if you want to reflect on that for a minute.
Oh yeah, totally. So yes, and I would say this is part of the leadership of an ICU, and we're all. And let me just back up. All physicians are leaders in some way, right? We lead multidisciplinary teams, but we also lead by our own example, right? And so when I have found what I have found is that trust needs to be built with everybody. It's not restricted to patients or families. It's not restricted to one uh, care provider or another. It's everybody. So I look for opportunities to build that trust with my nursing staff, with my respiratory therapy staff, with my dietitians, with my multidisciplinary team, with my administrators, as well as my patients and families. And so, yes, we're all different. We all have different backgrounds. We all have different perspectives and experience in the world that we bring. And one thing we need to do is listen to each other's stories and listen to each other. And of course, in this climate, in the worldwide climate and political climate, it's hard to listen to each other, right? That it takes time, it takes effort, it takes skill. And so circling back to your question, though, when you have a situation where there is a difference of opinion, the first thing is to stop and be aware that there are different opinions, and to be cool and professional, and to start listening and being curious about it, not being judgmental. And maybe we can get into some of those techniques, but because it applies to patients who don't want to receive your recommendation either. I mean, this is kind of what I wrote about in that LA Times piece, is that what did I do when they said, you're killing my brother, or whatever they said. I don't remember exactly what they said to me, but it's about slowing down and listening to the story, and being curious about where that story is coming from, because it will open doors not just for the communication and the decision making, but it actually can open doors in yourself too, and you may find out that you have biases you never even learned about. Baron Lerner, in a great New England Journal piece a couple of years ago, he talked about vaccine hesitancy, and he basically asked us, the reader, to think about being curious, because when he asked his patient, who ended up being an African American patient who didn't want to get the vaccine for COVID in this situation, he started learning things about that person's background and the cultural legacy of vaccination in his generational inheritance. Just what happened to his ancestors and everything else that allowed him to really understand where that hesitancy was coming from, and also what he was doing as a care provider, what he could do to bridge a gap that he obviously was witnessing in real time, right? And at the end of the piece, I don't think the patient was still accepting the vaccine, but he was a heck of a lot closer to basically receiving other types of recommendations than otherwise. And I would say the same thing applies to, let's say, the nurse or the respiratory therapist or someone else who needs support. We all need support. We all need challenge. These are parts of what Ayala Pines talked about in the 1980s about burnout. Leaders need to create social spaces where we can get both of those things. And again, there's a ton to unpack here, but I would say
Yeah.
the short answer, I'm trying to make this short. The short answer is you gotta listen to others, listen to their stories, find the common ground, and find the synergy spaces, and lean into that. And it may be something that you don't completely subscribe to, but that is where the collective power and movement can come from.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot there. But I think that what really resonates with me is this idea that, it's not necessarily about getting somebody to change their mind, right? It's more of a journey than a destination. It's like we can have a conversation, we could see like I might not make the same choice that you're making or that you're making for on behalf of your loved one, but you're articulating why you're making that choice. You're articulating what your concerns are, and we can talk about those. And maybe that leads to a change in decision. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe we're just sort of setting ourselves up for a conversation later about something different. Similarly, like I find sometimes people will say like, "Are we really going to code this person?" And you know, there's a lot of patients who fall into this category where the family wants quote everything, and we as healthcare professionals look at the situation and say like this is not going to go well. But I mean, people have the right to make choices that we don't agree with, right? Like if people didn't make bad choices, like we basically wouldn't have a MICU, right? I mean, like most of the diseases that land people in the hospital are at least in part related to choices that they made that maybe we don't recommend. And I think sometimes it's more about like, okay, like I understand where you're coming from. This is not how I feel, but I understand what you're saying. And then that's sort of a starting point maybe for more conversation.
Nick, I think that what you're getting at is another point, Venkatesh, that you'd made earlier. Is just like, yes, you may not come to a consensus, but you're setting the stage for that trusting relationship that you might need tomorrow or 3 days from now or a week from now when you're having that really difficult conversation, and maybe things will go better at that point because at least you've demonstrated to your patient that They can talk to you. They can share their perspective. I like that idea of being curious. I'm reminded of Ted Lasso, who said in the Apple TV show, "Be curious, not judgmental." It's the same idea, right? It's create this like warm environment, and you may not agree with the patient, but at least you owe it to them to give them the opportunity to share themselves with you at this time, which is or the patient or their family, whoever it may be, at this time that's often a very vulnerable time. And at a time which I often say, like when I'm working with trainees, like when I meet a patient or I meet their family, it's probably on or close to the worst day of their life. I think when I remember that, it really helps humble me and remind me to be a good listener. And if I need to be a shoulder to cry on, so be it. If I need to be a sounding board, so be it. But I think,
Nobody seems like a jerk when you remember that, by the way. Like,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just like it's very hard to feel like hurt because somebody was
yes.
rude to you when you remember that they're having a way worse day than you are, like assuredly.
I think where it gets questionable, and this is, I'm curious, Venkatesh, to hear your thoughts, is when you marry that philosophy with the idea that, we as doctors, like you can't pour from an empty cup. So you can only
Mm.
do that, I feel like, so many times until you're like, I'm done. I'm out. My tank is empty. How can we try to stifle that emptying sensation?
Yeah, that is wow. Okay, let me respond a little bit to what you both have shared, and then I'll get to your last question, which I think opens a whole other topic.
Yeah.
You're
Sorry.
absolutely right. No, no, this is yeah, this is the world we live in, and this is what I love to talk about. So, Nick, to your point, yes, I think the context here is important, right? Because patients and physicians, or even nursing and physicians, there's a asymmetric power dynamic there, right? It's just naturally built in the system. And so when you've got a patient or somebody else who's basically um, disagreeing with you, there's a gap that needs to be bridged, and it's not going to be done with rational argument most of the time. I mean, we like to be rational. We like, science is rational, all that. But when you're talking about how someone feels about something and it comes through, you got to use some other tools. You have to use, and that is where the trust building comes in. And when you're curious and you ask and you listen, that's where that can express itself. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you're absolutely right also that just because you connect with someone doesn't mean you agree with them. I think there's a false equivalence between empathy and agreement,
Mm.
that leads to decision making that hurts people down the line. It may help in the moment. You might feel, immediate relief or something, but it can actually cause more damage. And maybe we can talk about that more later. But I think that's important too. So it's okay to have a difference of opinion, but also be mutually respectful. I think that is a doable and achievable goal. Now, to get to Cyrus's point, wow, you really hit on something that I think is crucial, which is this whole idea of compassion fatigue, right? We're basically asked to give, right? And where is our well-being in this whole mix? I actually just reviewed a case, and I talked to providers yesterday about a patient who unfortunately had a terminal situation, and the family insisted that the patient had to have a cardiac arrest and have their demise in that fashion. And so the decision by ethics and everybody else was that that had to happen. And what I asked the providers and even nursing was there anything done for the providers to help debrief or process the feelings around seeing that unfold in real time? And sadly, the answer was not really. It was basically me talking to this physician, this intensivist, and me reaching out to nursing to see, what happened, because I think the notification was from a non-physician. And so I think so it basically speaks to what is this whole thing about self-care? Like, what does self-care really mean? And I think that certainly as I've done a ton of reading on this and I've thought about this a lot, I think we as physicians do a terrible job of self-care. And it's not all our fault. I mean, we come from a very hierarchical, very demanding training period where we literally are taught, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, or both, to put our own needs and wants aside. Like we don't eat well, we don't sleep well, we don't nourish our different selves. Trotter Matheson and Scoveholt wrote a book about personal self-care in the counseling professions. This is, psychotherapy. And I think it had complete relevance to medicine, the traditional medicine practices, because in contrast to the counseling professions where they literally say that if you're not taking care of yourself, and he talks about different selves, meaning he differentiates into like the nutritious self, the physical self, the spiritual self, the emotional self. I mean, all these different selves, right? If you're not doing that in parallel with your caring and counseling work in the profession, you're not doing your job. Like you can't do it. You cannot do one without the other. And somehow in medicine, and let's say the ICU is probably the worst, one of the worst. It's the opposite. I mean, we are literally giving all the time. And how often have we really talked about what our own needs are for self-care? And again, all those different. And now I would say that one other added thing is we've made another false equivalence between resilience and coping. Like we look at coping mechanisms outside the workplace to substitute for finding fulfillment and self-care in the workplace. And I think that there's obviously a value to doing things outside. I'm not saying that. But it's not a substitute. It's not an either or. It's not black and white. You need to do both, right? And so that's where my attention has really focused. What can you do in the workplace? What can you do for yourself as you're treating patients, as you're dealing with these emotional situations, these charged situations? How can you take care of yourself and move through that so you can not just give to others, but also give to yourself? And by giving to yourself, you're able to give to others more. So we can dig into that more, but it's this idea of self-compassion, which I just think is completely missed and is a primary driver of what we consider moral injury and burnout. I think they're linked, and it's definitely connected to both.
Do you want to say more about that? Actually, let's actually double click on that now.
Sure. Okay. So self-compassion, another great book by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer called The Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. They've actually written other books on this, but the idea is that, self-compassion is something that we just don't do very well. And I would say some of these high commitment professions, it's even worse because we grade success in certain externally validated ways, right? And so there is a value and a need, especially in this age of burnout, to really look at what self-compassion is. And they break it down in a couple of ways. And I'm not going to I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but there are three different components that they talk about. One of them is kindness to yourself. So think about all the guilt and shame that we carry. You may not even be aware of it. I certainly wasn't for years and years around when we make medical errors or when bad things happen to people. We think it's just our responsibility.
Or just when you sound stupid when you say something. I mean, I feel like that's a very common one, right? Like
right.
Every medical trainee has had that moment where they know the right answer, but they can't say it, and they go home and they're like, ah.
Absolutely. I mean, we have been tested so much in certain very, very sort of traditional methods that when you get something wrong, it's we have an attribution problem. It's like we're bad people because we made an error, right? And so we don't have a good mindset around it, and we don't have any places to really process that, right? So being kind to yourself, and they go through different exercises on how you can cultivate that. That's one aspect. The second aspect is being mindful, and there's a whole. It's become quite popular. The whole mindfulness practice. It's a Buddhist sort of bent to it, but it's about understanding what's happening in the moment and not thinking about what happened before and not what happened after. It's about just being with yourself in the moment and feeling what you're feeling and where you're feeling it and just exploring that. Just kind of like being curious about yourself in those moments. Okay. And then the third part is about the common humanity, that you're not alone. This is not your cross to bear alone, and that nobody else is suffering like you are. No, we are all connected in this suffering landscape. And there are ways to address that, but to realize that you're part of a common experience, that itself is part of the self-compassion approach. So anyway, those are just some basic tenets to the idea. And I think that if we can cultivate that, especially in the ICU setting, which obviously it seems like a non sequitur, right? I mean, you're dealing with life and death, and what's the order, and you're going to go, resuscitate someone. But I think it's possible, and I think it's necessary. And when we think about burnout, we have to think about our own ability to be whole, in addition to trying to fill up somebody else's emptiness. So that's just speaking to Cyrus. When you said the word emptiness, it sort of it resonated with me, because I do think there's emptiness all around, but you can't fill someone else's tank until you've kind of filled your own.
Yeah, so a lot of feelings right now that I'm sort of processing as you eloquently walk us through that. Um, yeah, we've said this a number of times already in recording here. Approaching minute 50, that every one of these topics that we are just scratching the surface on is a show in and of itself, or a season in and of itself. Who can say? I wanted to ask about something a little bit different, but something you'd mentioned earlier, Venktesh. And then if we want to come back to some of this, we certainly can. But you sort of alluded to a source of burnout or moral injury when you were telling us about that 94-year-old lady and her family, and that they'd asked you about whether hospice was going to be covered by Medicare, and you kind of were like, "Oh, I think so," but you didn't really know for certain. I think that is a microcosm of so much of how I and perhaps other people feel, where because we are physicians, because we are in this very privileged position, there's this expectation, whether it's self-imposed or from the kind of just the community, that we have an answer for every question, and that we have to know it all. But then you juxtapose that with a world where the body of literature for any disease state, let alone just kind of like socio-politico-economic kind of elements of medicine, the knowledge base is growing exponentially and asymptotically, it seems, in the era of AI. So I guess what strategies can we implement as privileged people in this role of, feeling like we have to have an answer to every question? How do we work through that to where we can maybe minimize some of the moral impact of that burden?
That's a great question. So, and I've struggled with this in the past, and I feel like the answer is kind of alluding to what I talked about earlier, is that we've got these pressures on the modern physician, right? Whether it's the information overload, the misinformation, the technology, the care networks, and the financial viability issues, right? The sustainable issues. And I think that the first step is for us to radically accept that that is what it means to be a modern physician. Okay. And I think that myself, burnout is driven by two different major drivers. One of them is a sense of agency, and the other is a sense of human connection. Okay. And those formulate what I call the new oath that we don't have to get into it now, but that is sort of the conceptual framework in which I complement that oath to a practice model. Okay. Now, what does that practice model look like? You're right. We can't know it all. There's no way. There's no way. But when we accept that these are our responsibility in some way and focusing on our agency and human connection, then I think there are doors that open. Okay. So am I an expert, like a coding and billing administrator, on the differences between billing codes and HCCs and RAFs and all? No, I'm not. I'm not. But I have a working knowledge. I have the language. I know the language that they're talking. And when I know the language that they're talking, then I can have a conversation. Then I find myself that I'm being invited to conversations, and I can start being part of solution building in a proactive way. and not being reactive. So when I ask about, hey, what is the payer mix? They may give me the details of it, but they know that it's on my radar, as opposed to a physician, let's say, or an intensivist who says, well, you know what, I'm just going to focus on whether this patient needs ECMO or not. And that's somebody else's job, or the example I gave of the 94-year-old. I know that Medicare covers hospice, but I didn't know what their particular details of their insurance plan, right? So, but what I could do is, and what I did in the moment was say, look, you know what? I know the case manager personally. I'm going to call that person, and guess what? In 10 minutes, we're both going to come back and we're going to talk to you, or she's going to come and talk to you. And that confidence, that's the human connection I'm talking about. There's a sense of agency that comes with competence. So we know certain things about coding and billing. And I never knew this. I mean, let me be clear. When I left fellowship, I had no idea about all the different codes and bills. And
right, we know a lot more about the Krebs cycle than we do about billing code.
I know, seriously.
Right.
And so when they just handed me a piece of paper and said, here are the codes, and I'm like, all right. And then I land, 6 months later in a Medicare audit, and everyone's pointing fingers at me saying, what are you doing? That was not fun, right? And so since then, I've learned to say, look, I got to have a working knowledge. Now, unwittingly, I am now a coding and billing advocate and leader for our division. So my peers, call me up and say, hey, look, is this critical care level care, or how does this work? And it helps them feel supported, but also it helps me feel like I'm making a difference. So again, to circle back to your original question is, can you know everything? No, but you can know enough to feel competent. And by extension, you'll have more agency and control, because now you're going to be part of decision-making in a new way, but you'll also be connected more to people. It may be through another person, or it may be directly, but you'll see the whole mission of creating healthcare delivery in the ICU, or what comes after the ICU or before, or whatever, becomes tangible and it becomes achievable. And guess what? Trust, here's that theme again, that trust comes out and it's expressed. And it feels good, Cyrus, Nick, it feels good. Like when I go to the hospital now, and the nurses, literally, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but when I walk into the ICU and the nurses say, oh my gosh, Dr. Ramnath, you're here. And that immediately sets my mood for the day. Okay. And it's because
whenever I hear that, like, oh, so glad you're here.
Yeah.
I know two things. I'm like, oh, that feels good. I also know it's going to be just like an absolute disaster, that there's something that I'm walking into, which is
but
like,
Nick, they also say that as they're running away from you. So I think you're misunderstanding.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think we've forgotten, is that it can actually still feel good. It doesn't mean that every day is going to be roses and everyone's going to live for another 10 years. No, it just means the experience doesn't have to be walking away with a sense of guilt, shame, doom, whatever, that fuels that, the lack of agency, the lack of connection, and you're just carrying it day to day to day. And eventually you realize that you're burned out because you're depersonalized, you don't have accomplishment, you're physically exhausted, all those different stigmata of what we know is our burnout signs.
I just want to share one thing because I know I could see the wheels turning with Nick and I want to give him the floor, but just wanted to share one thing because I think it fits here nicely. For me, another thing I'd add, and I say this to my trainees all the time, is my coping mechanism for this pressure to know everything is to embrace vulnerability and basically say, look, like, I don't know, but kind of like you were saying, I don't know the answer to your question, whether I say that to a trainee or to a family or whomever, but I'll be damned if I don't figure it out. And so whether that be leveraging my resources or whatever, and I found initially that made me very uncomfortable because I felt like I needed to be this like supreme source of knowledge and leadership and so on and so forth. But then it occurred to me that by doing so, I was setting what I think is a really good example for those that work with me, those that work around me, with future generations of intensivists, in the sense that it's Like, not only is it okay to not always have an answer, it's kind of expected because, again, the world that we work in, let alone the world at large, is so tremendously complex and evolving by the millisecond.
Yeah, can I follow that up with piggyback off that for a sec? Absolutely, you're right. And but there's a way to do it where you can still have a win-win situation. So, for example, imagine the difference between saying someone says, "Hey, I need this," or Medicare doesn't cover it, whatever they say, and you say, "Well, I don't know. That's not what I do. That's not my scope. That's not my purpose here." Call medical records. But the difference between that and saying, you know what, actually, that's a really good question. Let's work together on that. Here's what I'm gonna do, and maybe you can help also with your part. So that again, it's like acknowledging that there's an issue, but also reinforcing that there's a bond and there's a teamwork approach. And this is what I think shared decision making is really means, right? And I reinforce that in my family meetings all the time. We're doing this together, not because the burden is going to be yours and not mine, or vice versa. It's that people feel supported, and when they feel supported, the blame game diminishes, the vulnerability sort of chasm diminishes, and you actually get to the end goal in a much more sort of I want to say productive and constructive, but also effective way. It happens much faster if you can actually build that pathway, as opposed to saying, "Well, that's I have no idea, and that's not my job," that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I'm just reflecting on the fact that I don't think that I've ever said, "I don't know," and then somebody was, like, unhappy with that answer. Like, it feels like somebody is not gonna find that sufficient, but you're right. "I don't know, but let's find out together," or, "I don't know, that's a great question. We should both learn about that." As opposed to, kind of making up an answer or saying, "Oh, this person will tell you." Right? People are very uncomfortable saying, "I don't know," but it's actually very powerful.
Well, here's the other thing to think about is, we live in uncertainty. I mean, medicine is an inductive science, right? We're constantly surrounded by uncertainty. And so, yes, I mean, coding and billing and, finances are one type of uncertainty. But think about when when you've got someone with ARDS and you have no idea why it happened, right? I mean, someone just showed up at your door. You don't have any medical, you don't have any records. You're in a rural
It was
hospital where
probably Tylenol.
it was probably right. It was right. Wow, that was a hot button. Okay,
That was triggering.
that was definitely triggering. But I have often found myself saying, "Look, to be honest with you, ma'am or sir, I really don't know. But here's what I've done to try to figure that out, and here's what we're going to try to do to try to figure that out. And tell me what your experience is of that." I mean, maybe I'm not that direct about it, so to speak, but the point is to not just drop it as if we do it in clinical medicine all the time. And what I'm asking your audience to think about is to translate that and exact it into another arena when it comes to whether it's the care network stuff and who's going to take over the care from here, or the financial stuff and what administrators would do. And I'll be honest, I mean, systems should adapt too. This is not just on the individual. I'll give a good example. At UC San Diego, we have a clinic for HIV patients and substance use disorders. And what they've done is restructure how those patients actually are seen in the clinic. So they see the social worker and the substance use counselor and other folks, financial folks, first. They see them first before they ever see the physician. So there are steps that systems can take in order to, favor success, right? But it doesn't mean that we as individuals don't have an ability to turn that needle. And I think I certainly I don't have that. I don't have that framework in my ICU, and I go to 5 or 6 different ICUs, which are all different in different ways. It relies on me, and I think we can do more.
So I was just going to ask about something that we've touched on a couple of times in this conversation, something which is kind of near and dear to my heart, which is the implications of misinformation. You said a couple of times about how one of the challenges is that it's so easy for misinformation to spread. It can be hard to differentiate reliable information from unreliable information. This really seems like kind of one of the defining issues of our time outside of medicine, but also inside. Um, it also seems like it's really polarized a lot of patients and families. In COVID, there were a lot of people who came to the hospital with sort of angry misperceptions about what was going on there because they'd been led astray by misinformation. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on this as a contributor to burnout and moral injury, and also kind of like what are the mitigations for this? Like how do we fix this intractable problem of our time?
Yeah, that's a tough nut to crack in a short amount of time. But I'll take a stab here. You're right. The misinformation is coming from all directions, really. We've talked about how I think there's an unprecedented amount of access to information, which goes way beyond the bedside and what we can do there. But I do think there are a couple of things that we can focus on. First is I think we mentioned the scientific attitude, and just to be really briefly talk about that quickly. Um, it's two components, as Lee McIntyre talks about. One is really leaning on the evidence and the quality of that evidence, and really just acknowledging that there is a thing called evidence that we really need to, focus on. And then the other part is being open to new evidence and not being dogmatic about the way things have always been done, kind of thing. And I think what you can gain by leaning into that is, number one, you can stay up to speed with what's happening in a formative way. And in my Substack, I do talk about different strategies to keep up with information. It can I often look at some kind of general information source. You choose Up to Date or some other source for just general information. But then you've got your discipline specific journals. Like for pulmonary critical care, we've got American Journal of Respiratory Critical Care Medicine. We've got CHEST. We've got society, the critical care medicine journals. So something that is general and something that's specific, and then in the moment to be looking up and have a source. Open evidence has become quite popular, and obviously PubMed and other types of medical literature resources. So there are ways to keep up to speed with what the evidence and how it's moving, and having a critical eye on that, but also discussing it with others in terms of peers can provide consistency and reliability and credibility that transcends your individual interactions, so that when you inherit a patient, when you come on service, you're not having to regroup from square one, right? And when you hand off to your next person, they're not feeling isolated and alone by having to reinvent the wheel from ground one. So I think that's one thing that we can do. The other thing that we can do is not be defensive or lead to sort of appeasing people in the moment. It's hard to hear tough, emotions and basically outright, just throwing out what you're saying. I mean, that is a tough thing to hear, right? But acting defensively, like ordering a bunch of tests or ordering a bunch of meds. I mean, we saw this during COVID all the time, right? I think it hurts us in a couple of different ways. One is it actually strips us of our own agency. I talk about how a sense of agency and connection are really crucial drivers of burnout. And when we start talking about the thing, we're going to order this test or we're going to, order that medication, we become less important. We become more accessories to the treatment rather than the principal agent, right? And
Right.
so I think that hurts us. The other thing is it takes our eyes off the ball of what decades of research in some cases have shown us. During COVID, actually, Wes Ely, at Vanderbilt, he had a New York Times piece.
Friend of the pod, Wes
Friend of the
Ely.
pod, awesome. I love it. He had a New York Times piece that said, "Hey, look, in this scramble to look for the next best silver bullet for COVID, we forgot about things like lung protective ventilation strategy. We forgot about ABCDEF bundle, which I know he is near and dear to his heart, and other types of tried and true methods that are they are taxing, they are effort intensive, But they do make a difference. And so when you start focusing on being defensive or just making people happy with ordering that ivermectin or convalescent whatever those things are, I think it hurts our sense of agency.
I think that's a great point. And I think that a lot of errors were made in this direction where people said, well, what's the harm in vitamin
Right.
C? What's the harm
Right.
in a little ivermectin? I think the harm is actually not necessarily to the patient, though in some cases, yes, but to the person ordering it,
Yes.
To the institution of medicine.
to the credibility. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
also I'll even add to this, our brand as a physician community. I mean, it's not so long ago. I mean, yes, it was the 1800s, but there was a time when anecdotes drove everything, right? You could not tell between a charlatan or quack and a really, astute physician, right? And it's funny to even remember this, but when I read this in the biography of Sir William Osler, iconic vanguard of modern medicine and the sort of creator of rounds and bedside practice in terms of the doctor-patient relationship. I mean, he was castigated for being a therapeutic nihilist. Can you believe that? Because he didn't want to just give anyone anything like these elixirs and all that. He wasn't signing up for that. And what he did, though, is he set a standard that in the Flexner Report of 1910 allowed the physician community to be branded as a professional discipline. There was credibility. And guess what happened is that part of that credibility, we saved lives. We did surgeries, we changed outcomes, the life expectancy shot up. We, diminished pain, suffering, illness, all kinds of stuff. And so when we start now to deviate from that, from the scientific attitude and saying that, well, I'll just do this because X, Y, and Z wants it or whatever, I think we start damaging the brand and we open the door unwittingly to other people who are now self-proclaimed experts. I mean, I wrote a piece on that in the San Diego Tribune about how everyone online now is an expert, right? And we're already facing a crisis of, credibility and experts. And we just don't need this. It's already hard enough. We don't need
The era of the influencer.
Exactly. We don't need to dig our grave any deeper than it already is. So I think those are some things that I think will help with trying to deal with this misinformation thing. And then the last thing I think I've mentioned already, but I'll just highlight it. We want to connect to each other, right? The sense of connection. So when we can work towards a way out of misinformation, meaning leaning into the evidence, leaning into what we know works and hand off to one another, we don't feel as isolated. We don't feel as on our own. And that actually feels good, right? We need that sense of community in order to get to our next goal in our own journey, personally and professionally.
So I think, this has been a great discussion so far, and we have a little bit of time left. And so, like I often say, if I go into a meeting with a problem, I also like to go into it with a potential solution, at least one course of action, so that I'm not the guy that's just, raising up a stink without any useful, contribution. So maybe we could take a moment to look ahead and talk about some solutions or frameworks that could be utilized to try to combat some of this burnout. And I know, in some of your publications, you've talked about building resilience through composure and clarity. We talked about this a little bit, but, trying to avoid defensiveness and leaning instead on calm demeanor, measured communication, that sort of stuff. And then in talking about confronting burnout and attrition and anti-science hostility, you've talked about systemic support, peer solidarity, and strategic communication, things like that. So maybe if you could sort of weave some of those terms, some of those ideas into a roadmap or a framework, if you like, for folks that are listening to this and who say, okay, I'm recognizing this problem of burnout becoming a burden for me and my staff. What are the first few steps we can take to get this thing back on the tracks?
Okay. Yeah. I will try my best to sort of capture that in three different sort of, they're broad, but they're direct strategies. Okay. The two drivers, as I mentioned earlier, for burnout in my mind are a lack of agency and a lack of human connection. The first point is look for ways to restore your agency. So that means things like look for opportunities where the scientific attitude can be bolstered, cite evidence, ask other people to share their evidence and discuss it with them. And it could be as simple as in the moment, even being more self-aware of how you are feeling in the moment. So breathing techniques. I do a lot of meditation. That's obviously not in the workplace, but you can take a few seconds. When I go into a family meeting, I take a few deep breaths that can set my mind to know what I'm feeling. And when I'm walking in the room, that gives me a sense of control and agency, even for a few seconds. That could be the difference between getting wrapped up in something and actually having clarity. So those are just a few things that in the moment you can use for that agency piece. Okay. The second thing is look for ways to connect with other folks. Okay. Communication strategies are key. So part of that self-awareness is knowing how you're speaking as much as what you're speaking and whom you're speaking with. So choose an administrator, choose a nurse, choose a peer, and say, hey, look, how am I communicating with this person? How effective was it? What was the body language and what I got back? Just sort of deconstruct it and sort of analyze it, not judgmentally saying, oh my God, I did so horribly. No, just think about it and sit with it and be with it and look for ways to connect with others. So when you hand off to your colleague on the next shift, think about how they might receive the information and what do they need for support on their end. I think those are some things that will build your sense of connection to others. And it includes administrators. It includes potentially executives. It's not restricted to patients, families, or other physicians or nurses. And then the last thing is, and we haven't even talked about it, is I do feel that the way through burnout, and in my framework, this is in the health architect model, this is the roof deck of the health architect model, which is wellness is not synonymous with health. Health is removal of illness or disease or something bad happening, right? Wellness is, as it's described, it's an aspirational pursuit of your full potential. Now, that could be medical, but it's also occupational, spiritual, social, environmental, and God knows what else.
It's kind of like the idea between the differences between surviving, living, and thriving.
Absolutely, yes.
They're different
you're
things.
Moving towards something, right? And so as physicians, as intensivists, we've spent so much time arriving at being an attending physician, right? We get medical school, okay, get to internship, okay, now get to residency, okay, now get to fellowship, okay, now get to attending, okay, now what? We don't think about where we are and where we want to go, okay?
Right. I think self-actualization is the roof deck of Maslow's pyramid there, right?
Right. No, it is exactly it. And I just don't think, I've certainly had to, I've had to think about this myself, but I've also had to open myself up to the uncertainty of what that is, right? Because it's not comfortable necessarily, but it is something that can really be a catalyst for our creativity, for our sense of discovery, and it can actually be exciting, right? There was a time when I thought, okay, gosh, medicine is just an algorithm. I mean, all I have to do is get the guidelines, plug in the antibiotics, and people will get better or not, right? I really kind of had lost that spark. And when I started thinking about my journey forward, as much as my journey until this point and where I was now, things started to shift a little bit, and I do think that it changes the experience from a transactional one to an experiential one. Like, how am I moving through what I'm doing, and both personally, but also professionally, how do they match and where do they diverge, right? And I have choices around that. I don't have to just do something just because, right? And that requires some self-acceptance, and it also requires some radical self-acceptance around what that is, and also what the workplace environment is. What is your 1, 2, 5, 10-year plan? Doesn't mean you have to have it all set in stone, but have you thought about that? What's the magic wand tell you, right? And what are the yeses that you keep saying no to? I mean, these are things that may not matter maybe today or tomorrow, but they can open a path of exploration that I think is is actually a daily exercise for me and is part of how we can move through burnout, because I do think it's about the future and not just the past.
I really like that because, like, especially that last bit, because I think the partner to the yeses you keep saying no to are all of the no's that you keep saying yes to, and we've been cultured to say yes to. Like every quote unquote opportunity, you got to take it. You got to take it, because if you don't, they're not going to keep coming, and then God knows what's going to happen after that. So I think that is like
I feel like saying no is like one of the most important life hacks.
And it's so hard to do.
It's so,
really
oh my
is.
God, I still struggle with it, right? And there's also, it's not just saying no, right? It's about how you say no too, and why you're saying no. And because no can be actually an empowering thing on both sides. It could really be an empowering thing for both sides. There can be a realization for yourself of your own limits and your own desires, hopes, dreams, whatever, that kind of thing. And you're not negating yourself, but also on the system side, they could say, hey, look, this is a real issue. This is a real issue that needs to be handled, maybe not as a one-off, but let's just say your division feels a certain way, or the physician staff or the nursing staff. And I'll give an example. I'm in a hospital now where there are a lot of different system pressures that are financially, difficult. And when I could build the bridge between what's happening in the intensive care landscape with what was happening in the ED and also in the nursing side across the entire hospital, we now created a unified sort of message that now we can deliver to the executives so that they can actually hear it. So there's an individual and a collective sense of agency that can come out of a simple realization that I'm not going to just say yes again.
Before we let you go, we've got to be sure to plug some of the great resources that you've produced. You've written a number of great articles in the LA Times and other places that we'll link in the show notes. But you want to tell us a little bit about your Substack, your upcoming book, and then where people can follow you on social media for more?
Yeah, great. And again, thank you for inviting me onto this podcast. I think it's a great work you guys are doing, and I hope some of the messages and topics that came up today will be helpful to your audience. So yes, as you mentioned, I am active on Substack. It's called Be a Health Architect. So please find me there. I post written pieces, but there's also a podcast option for those of you who like to listen. I'd love to get feedback. And if there are topics that you want to hear about, please let me know. I'm really just open and interested in building this community. I do post on X under my name, which is at Venktesh R, but also Be a Health Architect. That's my handle on Blue Sky and Instagram. And I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I'm trying to build that platform as well. I have written a book that I'm hopefully going to be published soon. It's called A New Oath: How to Find Meaning, Overcome Burnout, and Improve the Doctor-Patient System Relationship as Health Architects. Just talks about some of the things that we talked about today, and the framework and the concept that it sits in. And I'm going to continue to write. Who knew that I'd be a narrative writer? I never thought I'd be a writer, but I'm going to continue to write for outlets that will take me. They'll be lucky enough that I would be lucky enough to.
And you keep writing, we'll keep reading. It's been great.
Right. So you can find me there. So please reach out, and I'd love to keep in contact with everybody.
All right, folks. Well, we hope that you guys enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Ramnath as much as we did. Phenomenal, kind of just basic scratching of the surface on some very poignant themes, I would say, in the world of burnout and moral injury. If you guys want to learn more about this topic, we've obviously, Venktesh has a number of resources that he just mentioned, and we'll have links to those on our website. If you want to learn more about other critical care time topics, we've got our show notes, and of course the website. We've got the tools there that Nick has worked tirelessly on. So that site for y'all is www.criticalcaretime.com. Grab a subscription to the mailing list, leave a comment, check out our store, all that good stuff.
Yeah, definitely buy some swag while you're there. We'd like to say big thanks. First of all, Venktesh, thanks so much for joining us. It was great having you on the show. We'll have to have you come back when your book comes out to talk more.
I'd love to.
We'd also like to say big thanks to our listeners. You guys really keep us excited and motivated and keep us going, particularly the listeners who have left us reviews, and particularly the listeners who have left us 5-star reviews. You really help expand the reach of the show and get the word out to others. We also read all your comments. We appreciate your suggestions, your feedback. It's really been great. If you haven't already, please share the show with others. Please leave a 5-star review if you haven't done that. And if there's other things you want to hear us talk about, please write to us or post and let us know.
And to that effect, when you do want to reach out to us, you can X or tweet or whatever at Crit Care Time, or individually at Nick M. Mark, at Askins_Razor. And I'll just nip this in the bud right now and say you can send your complaints and concerns to me, Cyrus at criticalcaretime.com. We're on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, YouTube, here, there, and everywhere. Just some permutation of Critical Care Time should get you to one of our resources.
All right, he's stealing my jokes now, folks. Anyway.
Had to.
Yeah. Also, big thanks to the production team that makes this possible. We couldn't do it without you. The folks over at Podpaste, Kurt Belknap for our theme music, and everybody who contributes along the way. We really appreciate all of you.
And finally, just some quick disclaimers. The views expressed within this podcast and any associated media do not necessarily reflect the views of our employers. All references to patients or encounters have been modified to be HIPAA compliant, and thus any similarities to real-world cases are purely coincidental. Finally, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be used in lieu of seeking medical advice. Whew, that was a mouthful. With that,
you got a future in reading the TV drug ads, man.
I'm working on it, man. I got to diversify. With that, thank you guys so much for listening and for being the best part of Critical Care Time. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Cyrus Askin.
And I'm Dr. Nick Mark. See you all next time.